Have you been asking yourself lately, what is diabetes? Why is everyone talking about it? And how does this affect me? Super important question, fairly complex if you really get into the details. And today we're going to break it down in a simple, easy to understand way that you can make real decisions in your life today. Hi, my name is Chris. I'm the Helpful Pharmacist. I'm a biochemist and a pharmacist. And today we're going to explain some information about your health that can transform the way you look at it and help you maintain your health into the future. The topic today is diabetes. It's a pretty complex topic, and one of the biggest questions I get from patients is, can you please explain this to me in a way that I can understand? And I get it. It's complex. There's a lot of topics and concerns. It affects a lot of aspects of your health, which makes explaining it in a really simple, easy to understand way not that easy. So if you're tired of complex answers, weird words, you don't understand what they mean, and end up being more confusing when you started, you're in the right spot. So let's get going. Before we get started, I do want to make some overall comments here. We're going to focus primarily on type 2 diabetes. Just as a quick aside, there's type 1, type 2, gestational diabetes. 90% plus of diabetics are type 2. So for the sake of the conversation today, we're going to focus on that. In terms of the effect on your body, it's all the same. The only differences are the causes. And because type 2 is the most common one, we're going to focus on that here. We are going to break this down into 3 parts. Today we're going to go over how do you know if you have diabetes and what causes diabetes. The most important topics, these are the questions we get the most often because people want to know, how do I know if I have diabetes, and they want to understand a little bit about it. The second part is going to be how to treat it and prevent it. And then the third part is going to be how serious is diabetes and what are the complications or consequences of those. And as another aside, everything I'm going to go over today is 100% accurate and correct, but we're not in a classroom. We're not graduate school students. So I'm not going to explain every aspect of every detail. The goal today is to explain it in the simplest fashion possible so you can understand it as best as possible. So let's get started. Okay, so the most common question we're going to get here is, what is diabetes? I want to explain it in a super simple way. So we'll start with how your body normally works. So you eat food, it goes into your stomach, and your body breaks it down into sugar or glucose. And that eventually gets absorbed in the blood, and that's why we call it blood sugar. So if you've ever heard anyone talk about blood sugar, again, we're measuring the amount of sugar in your blood, and it gets there because you eat it, it goes in your stomach, it gets digested and absorbed. And again, the component here that we're focused on is the amount of sugar in the blood. That's what we mean when we say measured blood sugar. The issue with diabetes is that we have too much sugar in our blood, or we have too much for too long, or some combination of that. So it really comes down to, it's an issue of how your body handles sugar or glucose in the blood. This is basically what diabetes is. So again, the simple answer is diabetes is an issue with too much sugar in your blood and the problems that causes. The next one we want to go over real quick before we get into it is, what is insulin? You may have heard about insulin before. It's a drug, it's a pharmaceutical, it can be prescribed. But it turns out your body actually makes it naturally. And so basically what insulin does is it helps your body actually absorb the sugar or the glucose. So like we just said, diabetes is commonly referred to as topics like blood sugar. The reason why there's so much sugar in the blood is you need insulin typically to get the sugar to go from the blood into the cells or the tissue. And again, the cells or the tissue or the inside or the fundamental unit. In this case, you can almost think of like your gas tank. So you need a pump to get the gas from the gas station to your gas tank. Insulin works very similarly. Insulin basically gets the blood into your gas tank, which in this case are your cells. Another little example I thought of was that it's kind of like trying to make bread, a cake, or pancakes without water. You have everything you need in the bowl, which is typically flour, but if you don't add water, you can't actually make something. So in some sense, insulin is similar, where you have all the ingredients you need, but until you put insulin, you can't actually do something with it, or you can't actually make something with it. So we also want to include, where is insulin made? Quick little intro about insulin. It's basically made in the pancreas, which is an organ right around here. You have little cells on the pancreas called beta cells, and these are basically where the insulin comes from. And the easiest way to explain it is that beta cells are like the ATM. So every time you need money or you need cash, what do? You go to the ATM, you put your card, money comes out. Every time you need insulin, the body basically goes to the beta cells and says, hey dude, I need some more insulin, can you hook me up? And then it gives you the insulin, and then you go on and do your thing. So just so we know where the insulin comes from and what it does, I do want to also mention insulin does a lot of things in your body. It's going to be 20, 30, 50, 100 different things. Again, we're only focused on it today in this limited context, but it's important to be mindful that insulin does a lot of stuff. And when our insulin doesn't work properly, or we don't have enough of it, it causes a lot of problems in the body, and that's the takeaway from insulin. So why is this a problem? Why are we talking about it? Why is diabetes an issue? Why is it a concern? Why am I making this video about it today? So one of the topics that I always like to use when I explain certain things is, oddly enough, too much of a good thing is oddly a bad thing. And some of the examples I'm using here just to make my point is that you need water to survive, but what happens if you try to drink 5 gallons of water at once? You're not going to feel very good, and bad things are going to happen. Another example is drinking alcohol. A lot of people like to do that. You have a cocktail, you have a couple drinks, whatever it may be. But what happens if you drink an entire bottle of alcohol? You get sick, you get way too drunk, you get passed out, bad things happen. You might forget them, whatever it might be. And then the third example here is if you eat an entire box of donuts or an entire container of ice cream, for a lot of people are going to get sick. So we're trying to illustrate the point that a lot of things work on extremes. Too much is bad, too little is bad. We need to be in the middle, and glucose is no different. Our body is designed to handle a certain amount of glucose or sugar, and when we have too much of that, either in terms of eating it or not being able to absorb it, it's a problem. Same thing with insulin. Too little is bad, too much is bad. It needs to be in the middle. So again, it's about balance. And again, some of the reasons why we're talking about this, the reasons why glucose is an issue or a problem, is that when you have too much glucose, it damages things. So it damages the tissues, it damages your blood vessels, it's not good for the muscles, it's very pro-inflammatory. So sugar or glucose, when it's high, increases the amount of inflammation in the body, which basically causes everything to not work well. It also changes how things in the blood themselves work. We're not going to get into that level of detail. The professional technical term is coagulation factors, for example. These are the parts in your blood that do other roles. When sugar's high, they don't work as well. They work differently. It causes a separate set of problems. And in general, because glucose is something every cell and every part of your body needs, because every cell or part of your body uses insulin, when these things aren't working properly, a lot of things in the body goes wrong, which is why some of the symptoms and issues can be all over the body. You can have issues in your head, issues in your chest, issues in your hands, issues in your legs, kind of issues throughout the body. So it's something that affects everything, and that makes the problems more diverse and sometimes harder to find. Before we really get into it, we're also going to talk about why does this matter? Because we don't want to invest time or energy for something that doesn't matter. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page and we understand this. So the first thing that I want to share here is that as of right now, 1 out of every 10 Americans is diabetic. So it's about 30 million people in the United States as of today, most likely more, who are diabetic. What's even scarier about that is that studies show that probably 9 million or more of those people who are diabetic, they don't know it. So there's about 10 million people in the United States right now who are diabetic and they don't know it. At the same time, in addition to diabetes, there's a concept called prediabetes. So you have normal, diabetic, and you guessed it, pre-diabetic in the middle. These are people who are increased risk for becoming diabetic. And basically people who are diabetic have about a 20 to 30% chance of becoming diabetic in the future. So it's like the middle stage. Studies show there's about 90 million people in the United States as of today that are pre-diabetic. So roughly 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 Americans is very much at risk for becoming diabetic. So if you take the people who are diabetic and pre-diabetic and add that up, it's about 130 million people in the United States alone. So basically 1 out of every 3 people in the United States is either diabetic or at risk of being diabetic. That's a huge percentage of the population, which means there's a high chance that you, someone you love, or someone you know is either diabetic or potentially going to become diabetic. It affects everybody. It's almost like an epidemic. And I think that's how we really have to shift our perspectives and have this become a bigger mainstream topic and a part of our narrative. Another really scary study have found that in 2050, in about 25 years, the number of people in the United States that are diabetic could become as much as 1/3. So right now it's about 1 out of 10, about 30 million. They are predicting that as many as 100 million people in 25 years can become diabetic. That's not including people who are pre-diabetic. So there's a potential future out there where half or more of the entire United States is either diabetic or at risk of being diabetic. If that doesn't classify as an epidemic, I don't know what does. And that's why we're trying to talk about it today. And you'll see if there's some really interesting things that you can be doing that we're going to go over in the series of talks. The other reason why it matters is that oftentimes people can actually become diabetic for years before they have symptoms. And unfortunately, because most people don't get tested for diabetes, which we're going to go over, they don't realize it until the symptoms happen, which gives it years and years and years to get worse. So unfortunately, when people get diagnosed with diabetes who aren't aware of it, they already have multiple issues. These issues have already gone from mild to moderate or potentially even severe. And instead of starting on day one on level 1, you're starting day 1 on level 5, which makes a bad situation even worse. Again, which is why education and conversations are so important. And today's topic, which is how do I know if I have diabetes, is one of the most important topics there is. Because most people, like we said, aren't aware of it. It takes a long time to actually be diagnosed, and a lot of damage can be done in the meantime that we want to hopefully prevent. And the example that I'm using here about why it takes 6 to 12 years for the symptoms to occur is it's kind of like buying things on your credit card and not checking the bill, which we've all done, right? You buy stuff, oh, it's fine, I can afford it, whatever it is. End of the month, you check the bill, you're like, uh-oh, I got a problem, right? What do I do now? And you got to figure it out. Diabetes is kind of something like that. For a lot of people, like I said, they either have prediabetes or diabetes and they don't know it. They keep buying stuff on that credit card, not making those changes. And eventually they see the bill, they get diagnosed, and they're like, dang, like I got a lot of problems right now. I don't know how to fix them. And then there's a really complicated situation you're going to find yourself in, which is why we're really focused on educating people on how to understand this and either prevent it from happening or get tested so they catch as early as possible. The other reason we were talking about this is diabetes has a large impact on things. So some of the major topics I'm just going to touch on real quick are cancer. So generally people who are diabetic have between a 20 and 30% increased risk of getting cancer. In terms of cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 cause of death in the United States, there's 700,000 deaths a year due to cardiovascular disease, which is 1 of every 5 deaths. Could be even more than that. Diabetes or being diabetic could increase the risk of cardiovascular disease by 2 to 4 times. And even for patients that are pre-diabetic, it can be up to a 30% increased risk. So it increases things like cancer and the #1 cause of death, cardiovascular disease, by 30% or more, to give you a reason why it matters. At the same time, when they look at people who are dying from diabetes, 50% of those deaths are occurring due to cardiovascular disease. So there's a major correlation between diabetes and the #1 cause of death, which is cardiovascular disease. There's also studies that show that diabetes increases the risk of dementia or Alzheimer's, potentially by up to 50%. So that's a big topic right now. Cognitive disease, cognitive decline, diabetes is a major driver of that. In general, it can shorten your lifespan for up to, on average, 6 years, which is, if you live to be 65 or 70, almost 10% of your entire lifespan. Again, we talk about the goal of life is to have a good life and eventually be able to retire, do the things you want to do. So this is directly potentially threatening your retirement and your ability to enjoy those last years of your life where you get to basically benefit from all of your hard work. Other examples are diabetes is actually the #1 cause of blindness in the United States. So about 24,000 people every single year in the United States become blind due to diabetes. It's the leading cause in the United States. And a lot of people who go from being pre-diabetic to diabetic or recently diagnosed as diabetic actually already have moderate or advanced eye disease in general. That's one of the most common problems, and oftentimes isn't diagnosed until it's too late. So again, another reason why we want to be proactive about this is that it causes significant eye damage, and oftentimes by the time we catch it, the eye damage is pretty severe or progressed quite a bit. Another one is that diabetes is actually the leading cause of amputations in the United States, so cutting a limb off. There's about 150,000 people every single year in the United States that lose a limb due to a diabetic cause or complication. And we're going to explain the reasons to that why. But obviously that is a tragedy. I personally can't imagine what that would be like to go through. And diabetes is the #1 cause of that. So it's another reason why we want to avoid it. And then the other reason why it matters is it's expensive. Even if you have health insurance, on average, studies find that patients are spending $3,000 to $5,000 a year just on their diabetic drugs alone. That's a lot of money. That's $300, $400, $500 every single month that you have to give the pharmacy for your drugs, even if you have insurance. I don't even want to talk about if you don't have insurance, the cost of it. It's thousands of dollars a month alone. People who don't have insurance, who are on insulin, have really bad diabetes, they could easily be spending $1,000 a month of their hard-earned money buying drugs instead of spending on themselves or loved ones or future, whatever it may be. So those are some of the basic reasons why this is so important, besides the statistics we shared with before. So again, before I go into the actual details, I just want to say that we're going to explain everything you need to know. And the focus is, how do you know if you have diabetes and what causes diabetes? That's the focus today. I personally think this is one of the most defining issues of our lifetime. It's truly an epidemic and it's only getting worse. And part of why it's so difficult is for a lot of people who have it, they don't know it. And because it's somewhat hard to know if you have it without getting the labs done, most people find out too late. There's a lot of damage already done, and the options are limited in what they can do. So we're going to start off with how you know if you have diabetes. This is very important, like I said, because there's about 9 or 10 million people in the United States who have diabetes and don't know it, plus another 90 million people at risk. So the simple answer here is you need to get a very simple, relatively cheap lab done. Anyone that has health insurance who sees their doctor once a year most likely is getting this, or can ask their doctor for it. You could also go to a CVS MinuteClinic, and in my area it was $35, and I looked at the prices today. It's typically between $35 and $60 depending where you are. So the CVS MinuteClinic, make an appointment. It can be a great, fast, easy, accurate way to know this. What A1C is they take a little sample of blood, they run it through a fancy machine, and it basically looks at that 90-day average of the amount of sugar in your blood. We put that into an equation, and it puts us into a chart. And that chart basically tells you where you're at. And the idea is that the more sugar you have in your blood, the higher A1C is. The less sugar you have in your blood, the lower your A1C is, effectively. We use A1C with percentages, so just bear with me here. So it's reported in percentages, typically between 4 and 10. Based off the guidelines, if you have an A1C between 5.7 and 6.5, you are considered pre-diabetic. You are at risk for being diabetic. And once you get into the 6s, you could potentially be diabetic with other criteria if they find that. If you have an A1C over 6.5, that is one of the main diagnostic criteria for being diabetic, and typically that implies you're diabetic. For people who have really bad diabetes, especially uncontrolled or untreated diabetes, their A1Cs are typically high 7s, 8s, 9s, or 10s. And when you come across a patient who's really struggling, who's really having a hard time, it's not uncommon to see A1C of 10, 11, 12, even 13 or 14 on the very, very extreme end. In terms of people who are not pre-diabetic or not diabetic, we're talking about A1C of less than 5.7. So something like 5.3, 5.4, 5.5. These are going to be common values for A1C. And that's what you're hoping to see when you get these labs done. The number one way to tell if you are diabetic, pre-diabetic, or where you stand in this is get an A1C lab done. It's very cheap, it's very effective, and that tells you basically immediately where you rank. I personally recommend for anybody who's concerned about this or has risk factors, as we'll go into, to consider getting your A1C measured twice a year instead of once a year. Because for me, just measuring it once a year is not enough. If you're going in the wrong direction, you don't want to wait 9 or 10 months to know that. And by doing it twice a year, you're more likely to get that information, which you can use to make lifestyle changes now, which is the goal. So you're kind of already went over pre-diabetic versus diabetic. It's basically where you are in the process, and we're going to explain that in further detail. I just want to again mention that people that are pre-diabetic, which is an A1C between 5.7 and 6.5, typically have between a 10 and 30% chance of progressing to becoming diabetic, and on average it takes about 3 to 4 years. So it's not guaranteed, but 1 out of every 3 roughly, 1 out of every 5 are going to progress to that within a couple years, which means that you do have time, which is why getting this lab done every year or twice a year is so important. Do not wait. The sooner you know, the better. Again, for patients that are pre-diabetic, they have about that 3 to 4 year time span to really make a massive change before they enter that diabetic category and they have to deal with those issues. Some of the things that can affect your likelihood from going from pre-diabetic to diabetic would be just how much sugar and processed foods you eat, which we measure in this case of fasting glucose. So the higher amount of sugar you have in your blood, that's the determining factor, which makes sense. Higher BMI. So you want to make sure everyone knows their BMI. Just go on Google and Google BMI calculator. You put in your height and your weight, tells you what it is. The goal is to be ideally under 25, definitely less than 30. Anyone over 30 has a risk. And once the BMI goes over 35, that's a real risk. So you need to know your BMI, keep it 30 or under to reduce this progression. High blood pressure can also be part of it, because like we said, diabetes and cardiovascular disease are very interrelated. So making sure your blood pressure is treated or is healthy is really important, and things like exercise can help that. There's also things like triglycerides, which result from unhealthy diet, eating lots of carbs, and also high cholesterol can also be a predicting factor of how likely you are to be going from pre-diabetic to diabetic. And then again, for diabetic, like we said, that's going to be an A1C over 6.5 using this lab value that everyone needs to do. And the key takeaway here is that most people are going to develop diabetes before they develop symptoms, oftentimes by many and many years. The sooner we catch this, the better. We do not want to let the damage occur and stack up and have to try to undo all that necessary damage. So the sooner we get tested, the sooner we keep monitoring our A1C. We're going to catch it as soon as possible and not fall into that category where we're letting the symptoms help us figure out we're diabetic. And again, once we have those symptoms, sometimes they can't be reversed, like eye disease and things like that, which can be very life-changing. Ultimately, I think of diabetes as one of the biggest health topics that isn't being talked about. And what's also interesting is a lot of people out there don't even know they have it. And that's really crazy to me, is that by the time you figure out you are diabetic, all this damage can be done. There's not a lot of things out there where you can go years and years and years without knowing and miss out on the opportunity to fix it. Again, in this case, there's at least 9 million people in the United States alone as of today who are diabetic who don't know it. So it's really one of these unique things where you could have it and not know it. There's not a lot of major diseases where that's necessarily the case. And then the example that I'm using is there are behaviors that we know are bad, and we know they're bad while we're doing them. I'm going to pick the example of drunk driving. You drink alcohol, you get drunk, you drive a car, you know you're doing something that's reckless and dangerous and you shouldn't be doing. You have that feedback, you know that. Diabetes doesn't necessarily work like that because you don't know you're drunk in that case. You don't know you're diabetic. So it makes it harder to make those decisions and to make those lifestyle changes. So the first one we're going to go into are what are the symptoms of being diabetic. Again, like I said, the most important number one thing is getting your A1C done, because a lot of people who are diabetic don't have those symptoms. So there's a lot of people out there, 4 out of 10 roughly, who don't have symptoms yet have it. We typically describe it as the 3 Ps, which is always going to the bathroom, always thirsty, and you have to go to the bathroom at night. So polyuria, polydipsia, and nocturia, which is peeing at night. Those are the main ones you want to look out for. There's also things like blurred vision. It's polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia, always hungry in this case. Those are the 3 Ps, although I didn't mention the third one here. Also, other symptoms to be mindful for are blurred vision. Those are the 4 most common ones. So again, the 4 most common things to look out for, besides the lab test for patients who are symptomatic, is always having to go to the bathroom, you're always thirsty, and you're always peeing at night, and you could potentially always be hungry, and you may also have vision issues. Those are the 4 most common ones. Less common could be weight loss, which is why you're always hungry, because your body's losing weight, you need to keep eating. And then also female patients may have increased risk of UTIs and other gynecological issues is another common thing. So if you've had 3 or 4 UTIs immediately or other types of vaginal issues and you don't know why, that could be another indicator of that. Some of the more extreme symptoms that may not necessarily present in the very beginning would be tingling or burning sensation, commonly in the feet. This is called diabetic polyneuropathy. Neuropathy would be nerve pain. Also, if you notice you have cuts, again, especially on your feet that aren't healing very quickly, that would be another sign, or numbness on the feet. So a lot of the neurological symptoms of diabetes typically involve the feet, and in terms of tingling, burning, or numbness, those are the main symptoms that present with that. And again, a lot of these are actually kind of hard to miss and go undiagnosed. It's really hard to I'm drinking more water than usual. I'm going to the bathroom more than usual. I lost 5 or 8 pounds, whatever it may be, and maybe it's not for my exercise program. So again, this is why it's so critical to get that A1C lab, because some of these things are kind of hard to identify, not in hindsight. We also want to go over some of the risk factors so we can be mindful of these things. These are things that we're going to talk about in other parts, but these are the components that we want to modify with our health. Talked about obesity. Definitely do not want to have a BMI over 30. Talked about sedentary lifestyle. So if you're that person who's never exercising and you're always on the couch, that's definitely a risk factor. Anyone that has hypertension, that's also a risk factor. That would be defined as a blood pressure of 140 over 90 or higher, which would make you have to measure your blood pressure at home. This is another quick example of why measuring blood pressure at home is so important. It helps you prevent or minimize these other issues. People who have high cholesterol or dyslipidemia issues are the risk factor. It's also worth noting that if you have a direct family member who has diabetes, it's been shown to increase your likelihood of becoming diabetic by 40%. So definitely if anyone in your family, father, mother, brother, sister, whatever it may be, are diabetic, definitely need to get tested once a year, as you do have that 40% increased risk. There's also gestational history or gestational diabetes. We're not going to talk about that today, but people who have had that is considered a risk factor. There are certain changes of ethnicity. So things like that can be factored into it. And age is also another risk factor. Typically, people are not going to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes until they're in their 30s. So definitely as we hit our 30s, absolutely every year, go get your A1C done. It's never too early to start. And more we're seeing people getting type 2 at a younger age. So I would say generally, really anyone in their 20s needs to be thinking about diabetes. It's a lifelong thing. It should start then. And the earlier you're going to catch it, the better outcomes are going to be. The other one I want to mention here for risk factors is overall cardiovascular risks. Because like we talked about, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death for diabetics. They're very related. And when you have cardiovascular problems, you have a lot of other issues that are hard and difficult to treat or prevent or reverse. And so I recommend looking up the risk calculator. How you can find that is going to Google and just type in PCE risk calculator or PCE calculator. It's going to ask you 5 or 6 questions about your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your height, your weight, your level of activity. It's going to give you a risk score. And that's a really great way of further identifying where you rank in this. If your risk is more than 5%, that means you need to do something. If it's more than 10%, you really need to either see your doctor or talk to your doctor. And if you don't have a doctor and your risk score is more than 10%, it's definitely time to go and do something now. So how does diabetes work? Now that we have laid all that down, we understand why it's important. We understand how it's a problem. We understand now that a lot of people who have it don't know it. A lot of people are at risk for it, and the sooner we can identify it, the better. We're talking about how it works. There's topics in this world that can be very simple and very complex. Diabetes is definitely both of those. And today the goal is to make it as simple as possible and slowly add the details in. And the focus especially is on what you need to know. That's what I'm going to focus on here. So let's just start off with what's supposed to happen the way the normal body works, which is basically you eat food, your body senses the food in your stomach, your body releases insulin, and then your body and the insulin helps your body basically absorb the glucose or the sugar into the cells. That's basically how it works. And I've used the expression before that insulin's like the dinner bell. You ring the dinner bell, you have the insulin comes out, and you're basically telling the cells it's dinner time, there's food, come get some. This also means that your body makes enough insulin and then your body responds to that insulin. And we're going to get into that. Those are the key features of it. So ultimately, we need to make sure the body makes enough insulin to stimulate the absorption in the cells. When the sugar in the blood gets absorbed into the cells, it decreases the amount of sugar in the blood. So that's how we lower the blood sugar. So again, we need to absorb sugar into the cells to lower the blood sugar. And when we can no longer move the sugar from the blood into the cells, the blood sugar remains elevated. That's what we're trying to avoid here. So now let's talk about when you're diabetic. Again, we went back down to the idea of too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And I use the example of putting things on your credit card and not looking at the bill. So it's fun to buy whatever you want, but what happens? Eventually you run out of money. That's how I'm going to explain the impaired insulin secretion. So you can buy on your credit card, but eventually you max it out and you can't buy anything else. So it turns out when you have too much sugar in your blood, your body's releasing too much insulin, and eventually it can't make more insulin, and then you have a lack of insulin. That's the first part of the problem. The second one, the analogy I'm going to use here, is that what happens if you eat ice cream every single day for every meal? Eventually you don't want ice cream. Even thinking about it can make you not hungry. So the second problem we have here is that the cells no longer respond to insulin. So if we're constantly giving the cells insulin, eventually, you know what, I'm done. I don't like insulin. I don't want insulin. Get the insulin away from me. Just like the example of eating too much ice cream. So basically what happens is that we release too much insulin to the point where we can't make any more of it. And because we have so much of it, the cells are like, you know what, I don't want to deal with that insulin anymore. Get it away from me. So that is the insulin secretion becoming impaired. We can't make enough of it. And the insulin resistance, the cells don't want to deal with anymore. And those are really the two big criteria about diabetes. You don't make enough insulin and the cells don't respond to insulin. And when that happens is we can no longer get the sugar out of the blood, and then the blood sugar remains elevated. That's really what diabetes is in a nutshell. So I'll repeat that one more time. You don't make enough insulin. The cells are no longer sensitive to insulin, which means the sugar gets stuck in the blood, and basically the blood sugar remains elevated. And like we talked about before, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, which means that when your blood sugar becomes elevated, bad things happen. It damages the blood vessels, damages the nerves. It becomes very pro-inflammatory, and all these other problems happen. Diabetes, as some of us already know, is basically a disease of elevated blood sugar, and it occurs because we're releasing too much insulin, and we lose the ability to make more of it. And we also have insulin resistance, and we can't absorb the sugar out of the blood anymore. And we're going to go that in further detail. This is just the most simple explanation of it. Again, like I said, it's not that simple. There are more complex things, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them. There are multiple ways the body makes energy. So what some people may not realize is your body obviously needs to be fed and full and have energy and all that stuff. The way the body usually measures that is how much energy the cells can make, or how much glucose the cells can make. So it's counterintuitive, is even though we have a bunch of sugar in our blood, if we don't have enough sugar in our cells, our body's going to consider it as being starved or hungry, or it's going to need more of it. And the example I want to use here is that when you run out of money, what do a lot of people do? That you borrow from a friend. Hey, can I borrow $20? I got to go buy something. Or I'm at dinner, can you loan me the money? In this case, what we do for loaning the money is we go to the liver. So because we can't get enough energy into the cells, because the cells no longer respond to insulin, or we don't have enough insulin to shift the sugar into the cells, it goes to the liver and it says, hey, liver, I ran out of energy. I know you don't want to do this, but I need you to help me out. The liver's like, okay, cool, I got you. The liver starts making energy. The process is called gluconeogenesis. There's multiple other ways, but that's the most common one. So that's what the body does in that case. But the problem is we still have sugar in the blood and it is elevated because we can't get it out, right? We don't have enough insulin and we don't have enough insulin sensitivity. And now the liver's also making its own glucose or its own sugar, which further makes the blood sugar go up. So this is where one of the bottlenecks happens, is we can't get the sugar out of the blood, which makes the cells think they're starving. They tell the liver, hey, help me out. The liver does its job, and then now it keeps going up and up and up, and there's nowhere to go. So this is another example of why there's multiple things going on and becomes complicated. It also turns out that in that case, the liver begins to do other weird things, and we have 3 separate problems going on at the same time. So it's complicated. There's lots of things going on. To make that even worse, going back to the pancreas, which is where insulin comes from, and the beta cells, when this blood sugar remains elevated and the cells are starving, the body's like, hey, pancreas, like, what are you doing, dude? Like, you need to get back to work and now. At this point, the pancreas is actually doing all it can, but the body doesn't necessarily know that. And so all of a sudden the body's pushing the pancreas too far. So the analogy I use here is imagine running on a treadmill that never turns off. That's also what happens to your pancreas, is it never gets a chance to take a break. No matter what it does, it's never enough. It keeps going because the glucose suddenly becomes permanently elevated. It never gets a break. And what we know typically is that when you leave something on for too long, it breaks it. So the same thing happens here with the insulin production. The pancreas gets overstimulated, and over time it begins to not work. There is a lab that we use oftentimes where you consume 75 grams of sugar, and then we measure your blood sugar 2 hours later to see what it is. Ideally, you want to be under 140 or preferably under 120. And typically when it's over 140 or 180, that's the criteria. My point here is that studies have shown that even if you get 140, which may not require you to have any symptoms of diabetes, you've already lost 70% of your beta cell production. So my point in saying that is that the ability of your body to make insulin is dependent on your pancreas and your beta cells. And it turns out when those beta cells become overstimulated or overworked, they basically die off. And they can actually die off really quickly. In fact, those cells can die off before you have symptoms, which again is why when people get diagnosed with symptoms, a lot of damage has already occurred, including the damage to their pancreas or their ability to make insulin. So it's a really important concept. I also want to include that it's been shown that environmental factors can play a role here, especially with things like epigenetics. We're not going to get into epigenetics, but basically it's a fancy word that says the environment determines which genes you're using. Obviously, we need the proper genes to have proper health. And if the environment doesn't allow us to use the proper genes, bad things are going to happen. So that plays a major role in here because as the inflammation is occurring, as the blood sugar becomes elevated, as the liver is working too hard, as the pancreas is working too hard, the genes are changing. And if they can't respond or the environment's forcing them from responding, bad things are going to happen. Some examples of things that can make that worse, again, are processed foods, contaminations like heavy metals, or chemicals around us in cosmetics and our clothes that we're breathing in. Those can all make things worse on an epigenetic level. And then the other thing that adds on to it too, like I said, there's a lot of things at play here, is that the fat cells get confused. And when the cells can't get enough energy, the fat cells are where they're storing the extra energy, basically say, hey, the body's starving, let me dump out what I have as a last-ditch resort to help the body out. So if all that wasn't bad enough, we have the cells starving, the blood sugar elevated, the liver working, making the blood sugar even more elevated, which we don't really want. We have the pancreas about to burn out from working 100 hours a week. All of a sudden, the fat cells jump and say, hey, I want to help. How can I help? When we dump all my fat contents into the body, which is the last thing we want at that point. That can cause liver deposits or fat deposits in the liver, which is another risk for cardiovascular disease. Because again, the liver's already making energy, and then that additional fat release from the fat cells makes that worse. It also makes the insulin resistance worse. It causes, again, like I said, the liver to produce additional lipids. It further damages the pancreas, and it also increases the blood sugar. So if you could imagine, if all those things weren't enough, the last ditch effort is the fat cells doing bad things, and it literally makes everything worse. So hopefully you can see here that there's a progression where it starts with one thing, and then two things, and then three things, and four things, and then five things, and they're all additive. And that's why it also accelerates. And that's also why it's considered to be complex, because obviously there's a lot of things I just said. There's multiple issues at play. There's a lot going on. I know it's a lot of information. We're going to recap it now here, though, to help you kind of understand it. The first thing that happens is that the insulin no longer works as well, and you can't make as much of it. And that also causes the muscles to no longer want to absorb. So you have issues with insulin production, insulin absorption, and sugar absorption in the muscles. That then causes the liver to do stuff that's not good long-term by basically making its own glucose and its own fat, which causes a problem. At the same time, there's issues in the GI that regulate all of this, and those things begin to become decreased. Those are called the incretins, and the GLP-1s actually work there. Then we have the liver and the beta cells working together, and the beta cells having a problem, so all of a sudden we can no longer make insulin. That also then throws off inflammation markers and things like cytokines, which are inflammation markers, which come to the epigenetic part we talked about. That then regulates the neurotransmitters, which are some of the hormones that regulate the whole system. Those become a problem. The kidney has an issue because all the sugar has to go to the kidney, and the kidney can't deal with it, and weird things happen there. And then, like I said at the very end, the fat cells say, hey, I want to be a part of this. What can I do? They start dumping fat into the body, and all those things come together at once. So that's 7 or 8 different things that can all play a role in blood sugar being elevated, which is why it is a complex disease, and that's why some people have a hard time understanding it. And we're trying to keep it simple today. Again, diabetes is elevated blood sugar that results in too much insulin, and eventually the body can't make that much anymore. And because we have so much insulin, the cells get tired of it, they become resistant, and it causes all these other tissues and processes to try to get involved. But none of those other processes are designed to work long-term, and eventually all break down and make things worse. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what diabetes is, how it happens in the body, and what causes it in the body, and what's actually going on in the body. Maybe more information than you want to know, but I think it's important to understand that, because as we talk about complications, how to prevent it, how to treat it, you're going to need to know all those things. And that's also why, as a quick aside, diet management is fairly complicated, or some people feel it's complicated with diabetes, because you can't necessarily eat only fats or only proteins, and you don't want to eat only carbs. And so because all those systems are at play with diabetes, and when you have diabetes, it makes dieting a little bit more confusing, and we need people to understand how diabetes works. So then we explain food choices. They have an idea of why you can't eat only fat, you can't eat only protein, you can't eat only carbs. It's got to be some combination of those. And there's a lot of ways we can do to measure that and evaluate that and advise patients on that. I just want to touch on, just to make this complete as possible, some of the complications, and then we'll give this close out and we'll do part 2 with more information to come. But some of the complications again, or our elevated blood sugar damages the vessels, the blood vessels. And it's important to understand that your blood vessels are like the freeway of your body. Everything goes on the freeway, everything goes through your blood vessels. And when the freeway is closed, it causes a huge backup, causes massive problems. And I think a great example of this is when COVID happened, all those ships got stuck in the ports got slammed, all those supplies got backed up on those ships, and all of a sudden all the stores ran out of stuff. So because the freeway is the way we transport and move, just like our blood vessels, when that port, the actual port in this case, gets closed or slowed down due to COVID, we can't transport the nutrients in our body. We can't transport the resources in our body, and all the tissues suffer. So that's why typically when we talk about complications from diabetes, damage to blood vessels is going to be one of those common topics, just to include that. And that's why we see that for cardiovascular disease, 50% of diabetics are actually dying from cardiovascular disease. A lot of the impact is occurring there. Part of that is because the high levels of sugar cause damage in the blood vessels. The blood vessels are very sensitive to elevated sugar. They're like the canary of a sort type thing. That's also why we see eye issues, because obviously the eyes have lots of blood vessels in them. They're very sensitive to that. That's also why we see things like foot damage and kidney damage, because they're all very blood sugar or blood vessel related. The other thing that happens, like we kind of just mentioned too, is the nerves also get damaged, because just like blood vessels, nerves are very sensitive. In fact, a lot of the damage to the nerves is thought to occur to the blood vessels. So the blood vessels get damaged. They don't give the nutrients the nerves need. The nerves are very sensitive to those nutrients, and the nerves begin to die and have issues. And that's why the nerves don't work. And that's why we develop things like neuropathies, so tingling, burning, numbness, muscle weakness. And that's ultimately what leads into the amputation thing we talked about earlier. Amputation risk is that people have numbness in their feet, so when they get a cut, they don't notice it, and the cut gets infected, or because they don't have good blood flow to their feet, when they do get a cut, it doesn't heal very quickly. And so it's been shown that the lifetime risk of a diabetic having a foot ulcer, which is a fancy word for a foot cut that gets severe or more complicated, can be as high as 35%. So this is why there's so many cases of amputations, is we now know that when the blood sugar system breaks down, it damages the blood vessels. When the blood vessels get damaged, it damages the nerves. And when those things happen, it makes it hard for us to react, respond, and heal to wounds. They get infected. We don't know they're there. Our immune system's also impaired because we're diabetic, and oftentimes results in foot amputation. Like I said, about 150,000 cases a year. Another major complication of all of this is just global inflammation throughout the body. Like we said earlier, high levels of sugar is pro-inflammatory. Inflammation is really not good for anything on a chronic level. And so when we have constantly elevated blood sugar, we're constantly inflamed. And that causes inflammation, causes bad things to happen throughout the whole body, is another takeaway. We're going to go into that in more detail. So again, I know there's a lot of information. I hope I kept it simple. Hope you guys follow along. So I think the number one takeaway is that we are all at risk for either becoming pre-diabetic or diabetic. That's the first most important thing. This is an epidemic, and we need to address it as such, which requires us to be informed, aware, and ultimately getting our A1C tested so we know where we're at. So the other things to be mindful of is making sure our BMI or our weight is managed properly, making sure we're exercising, because that helps with our weight and our management of our blood sugars, and having a healthy diet. We're going to explain all those more in the following parts. We're not going to touch on those today. Time and knowing now is the single greatest thing you can do to help prevent this from getting worse. I can't emphasize that enough. Get your A1C tested once a year. If you want to look up more information on your own, some really good resources, if you go to Google, you just type in ADA, that's the American Diabetes Association. You can also go to the CDC for diabetes, so just Google CDC diabetes. They have some good information. Diabetes.org is another good one. And another one that I actually like, it's called Brigham and Women's Health. It's a hospital. And if you do Brigham's and Women's Health patient education, they had some really nice educational materials. I think they had 15 or 17 separate little one-page pamphlets that explain this as simple as possible. They're good for reference. We need to start today, because this is not something we want to wait for, especially for the people who already have diabetes and don't know it. They cannot afford to wait longer. So it's really important that we come together. You need to tell your friends and family, make sure everyone's aware. Odds are we all know someone who's at risk or affected by this. And so if you have people you love or you care about, you should talk to them about this, come together as a group or community and work on this together. Because when you work with other people, it motivates you, it inspires you, you pool your resources, it definitely increases the benefit of good things happening. So stay tuned. Again, this is part 1 in a 3-part series. The next one's going to be how to treat and prevent diabetes. And the third one is going to be how serious is diabetes and what the complications are. And spoiler alert, we're going to talk about CGMs, which I think is going to be the future for preventing all of this. I'm currently wearing mine right now. I have a Dexcom on. Again, CGM is a continuous glucose monitor. It's one of the coolest things ever. It's taken them 30 to 40 years to make this technology. And why I'm so excited about CGMs right now is in the month of August 2024, they're finally going to become available without a prescription. So previously, you have to have a prescription to be able to get a CGM, which has prevented a lot of people like myself from getting them because I'm not pre-diabetic and my doctor won't prescribe me one, even if I offer to pay cash at the pharmacy. This problem's going to be fixed. It's called Dexcom Stelo. They're going to be coming out this month in August, like I said. They won't require a prescription to get them. And I'm going to explain in the coming videos how a CGM is probably the second or third best way to really prevent or treat your diabetes, I'm going to go into that in more detail. We will be able to sell those through our pharmacy business. So again, I am talking today from my pharmacy. It's your personal pharmacy. We're located in Southern California for people who are looking for a pharmacy provider. We also do a lot of wellness and health coaching services. So if you're someone who's wanting to improve your health, but you don't know how, if you're sick or not on prescriptions yet, we can help both of those people. We also have our own online supplement store. So if you just go to yourpersonalpharmacy.net and click the shop tab, it'll take you to our supplement store. We have a lot of really great information and products on there. Again, supplements are very confusing. And so what we do is we take out the confusion for you. We have a pharmacist curated inventory. We basically simplify the approach so you know that the brand and the product you're getting is the best one available. You could also buy CGMs through us. So once the CGMs become available, you'll be able to order them to the pharmacy through the website. So stay tuned. If you have any questions about that, definitely contact us below. You can either subscribe to the channel, send us a message in the comments. We can respond to that. I can also be reached at welcome@yourpersonalpharmacy.net. If you have any questions or you want to get any additional information. I know that's a lot of information. I appreciate you staying to the end. Again, there are a few things that are going to shape the future more than diabetes. Unfortunately, most people are not aware of it. We're doing everything they can. And there's a lot of people out there that already have issues with diabetes because they don't have symptoms or not aware. So we're really trying to spread awareness on what we can be doing to be mindful of this, treat it, prevent it, and understand the information and spread it throughout the community. Thank you again. My name is Chris Regas. I am a pharmacist and a biochemist. I am the helpful pharmacist, and I am representing Your Personal Pharmacy today to help spread information to my community and to you guys about what you can do to help improve and prevent these things from happening in the future. Thank you, and stay tuned for more information to come.